Hey, AP Psych, this is Unit 8, Lecture 1. Unit 8 is our abnormal psych unit, and this lecture is all about an introduction to mental disorders overall. It also discusses the DSM-5, which will be very important, and of course I will explain what that is. But this is kind of just the broad strokes, the broad overview of what makes behaviors abnormal, and kind of how society and medical professionals approach them. So let's get into it. We have a handful of learning targets. Okay, so I'm going to give you some statistics, mostly throughout this unit, really, mostly to give you perspective. These are not the sort of thing that you are going to be tested on, but I think it's really important to help you recognize how prevalent it is in society and how important it is to understand these. Not just for the AP test, but because you are quite likely to encounter either in your personal life or in the life of the lives of those in your social circle, some sort of psychological disorder. As you can see here, approximately 1 in 5 adults in the U.S., 43.8 million, or roughly 18.5%, experiences mental illness in a given year, even if it is just a short-term mental illness. Approximately 1 in 25 adults, 9.8 million, or 4%, experiences a serious mental illness in a given year that substantially interferes with or limits one or more major life activities. And I want you to note my source, NAMI.org. This is a great resource for all things having to do with mental health issues. So I strongly encourage you to pop onto their website at some point and poke around. Many disorders are cultural, but many also exist in cultures around the world. So we'll get into why that's relevant in just a minute. So what is abnormal behavior in the first place? How do we define it? Why is it important to define it? Haven't we all behaved abnormally at some point or other? Yes, of course. We've all been a little bit odd, a little unusual, a little weird, and in many cases, that's what makes you you, and that's awesome. But at what point does that abnormal behavior present a danger to you or to others? At what point does it require medical intervention or perhaps even detainment, perhaps checking someone into inpatient care? How do we know where that line is? Well, we rely on the APA to define it for us. And it could be summarized in these 4 Ds and a U. These are the characteristics that the APA has said help identify abnormal behaviors. The first one is deviant behavior, where the behavior goes against the norms of the culture that the person lives in. Something that may be inappropriate or atypical in one culture might be normal in another, so this is not a worldwide definition. There are definitely phobias and other behaviors that are prevalent in one society and not another. The next one is distressful. Is the behavior causing the person to be upset? Does it bother them? Is it something that's upsetting to them? Is it dysfunctional? Is it causing disruptions in a person's daily life where they can't go to work? They can't have healthy interactions with family and friends. They cannot care for themselves. At what point is the behavior dangerous? Is it causing harm to themselves or others, or is maladaptive behaviors occurring? So maladaptive behaviors, think of like an adaptive behavior, like I'm sad, so I'm going to spend some time alone with my feelings and maybe do things that I know that make myself feel better, maybe go for a run, or maybe just talk to a friend, versus I'm going to have lots of drinks of alcohol. That's maladaptive. So when the behavior isn't just helping you cope, but it's probably helping you cope, but in a dangerous or hurtful way. Okay. So this goes beyond simple reactions to common stressors, or perhaps like losses of a loved one, or even things that are part of like a cultural norm, like going into a trance state in a religious ceremony. Okay, so this is beyond acceptable. It's unjustifiable and it's not reasonable behavior. So if we think of something like ADHD, which if you've ever been to a school, you are probably familiar with ADHD. At what point is it causing? So we have children that conduct hyperactivity all the time. At what point does it need treatment? Well, this is a very controversial one, first of all. But at what point does it cause the child to go against the norms of the society that they're in? Is it upsetting to them? Is it disrupting their life? Is it causing harm to them, causing them to make bad choices to cope with it? And is it based on unreasonable trigger? So if the hyperactivity fits one or more of these categories, then it might be worth seeking out treatment. Okay, just a bit on the history of psychological disorders. I feel like this will not come as a surprise to you that generations ago, people that were seen to have a psychological disorder or were crazed in the mind often faced really awful treatment approaches. Things like trephination, actually boring holes. You can see this picture, boring holes into a skull to try to remove evil forces. Exorcisms, being caged like animals, being beaten, burned, castrated, mutilated, and transfused with animal blood. There was a belief too that the fluids of a person, if they became imbalanced, it could cause psychological disorders. But then somewhere along the lines, in the 1700s, early 1800s, Philippe Pinel, a Frenchman, determined that madness was not due to demonic possession, but an ailment of the mind. And this doesn't mean that treatment methods were suddenly perfect, but what it did do is it led to the development of the medical model. And this was the medical health movement where mental illness was determined that it needed to be diagnosed on the basis of its symptoms and cured through therapy. And so it's just like it sounds, that mental illness had a medical cause and should have medical treatments as opposed to something based on evil spirits and demons. And it potentially could be cured, and that may include treatment in psychiatric hospitals. You may or may not know that the history of psychiatric hospitals is certainly not a lot better than the treatments mentioned in this slide. But at least that was where a corner was turned on the approach to mental illness. Since the development of the medical model, psychological treatments have progressed towards a biopsychosocial approach. And hopefully you recognize that word and graphics that kind of have looked like this throughout this course. And this approach assumes that biological, sociocultural, and psychological factors combine and interact to produce psychological disorders. Whew, that is a mouthful. And you don't need to write down each and every one of these bullet points, but the idea that it's not just biology, it's not just the environment, it's not just the mind, but that the interaction of these things results in a potential psychological disorder. And this led to one more model, and that is the diathesis stress model, sometimes known as the stress vulnerability model. Basically, it's the idea that your genetics, let's go through this fancy way of saying it. Disorders require the interaction of a diathesis and a stress, so that your body has a predisposition in your genes, in your chromosomes. You may have a predisposition to a mental health illness, but it still requires some sort of environmental trigger or stressor to make that mental illness emerge. So basically, by combining genetics and those environmental stressors, that could increase or decrease the likelihood of developing a disorder. This has been proven, or at least there's evidence that supports this idea through the study of epigenetics, which is the study of an environmental influence on genes. So basically, maybe you're born with a gene that could lead to a mental illness, or perhaps at a young age you experience a trauma and it leaves a marker on your genes, which later on could lead to a mental illness if you are exposed to a certain environmental stressor. We're going to go over how the different perspectives on psychology would view the development of mental disorders and view clinical psych as a field. This is coincidentally a great time to review your understanding of the major perspectives of psychology. So hopefully this rings some bells. If you come from the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic perspective, you probably believe that disorders come from unresolved childhood conflicts. And so to understand where disorders come from, you've got to look at perhaps suppressed memories, or influences from childhood trauma. If you are coming from a behavioral perspective, you believe that disorders are actually learned responses, that you have to analyze how was this disorder or these abnormal behaviors, how were they learned, what's been reinforcing them, what's been making them continue. So if perhaps a hyperactive child is getting reinforcement by acting that way, perhaps that's actually contributing to the development of someone's ADHD. A cognitive perspective would say that the cognitions themselves, someone's thoughts and beliefs are the root of a disorder, and that there's something in their mind that is making them think an unrealistic thought, perhaps about their body image, or perhaps about what is going to happen to them if they venture out into public, things like that. And the only way to fix behavior is to change those thoughts and beliefs. The humanistic perspective would say that people are responsible for their own behavior because it's the one that focuses on your sense of self. And even abnormal behavior links back to your sense of self, especially how you view yourself in relation to society and those around you, your peers, your family, the relationship between the individual and society. And the humanistic perspective would say a disordered individual doesn't have a good sense of self-worth. And maybe that could be fixed because they probably have conditions of worth placed upon them, like perhaps to not be anxious, to not be depressed, to handle the difficulties of life, and that those conditions are put upon them, really making those feelings worse. The sociocultural perspective might sound similar, but it's a little bit different. And here it's that abnormal behavior is shaped by family, society, and culture. So not just that a person is measuring themselves against perhaps unrealistic expectations of those around them, but is actually being influenced by those around them to behave a certain way. And so a person's relationships with others can support or even cause abnormal behaviors. I think a really good example of this might be someone who's growing up in an abusive household or is in an abusive relationship. And then stresses that one encounters can influence the disorders that they have and even the ones that they don't have. Where do the classifications and definitions of psychological disorders come from? If you recall, I said it at the beginning of the lecture, it comes from the APA, but how do they specifically do it? They do it using something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Okay, you absolutely need to know this book. You may call it the DSM. That is a very common term. The DSM-5 is the latest edition from 2013. Before that, the DSM-4 was the edition that had been in existence since the 1950s. And in the 1950s, it only identified 60 psychological disorders. And in the 2013 version that is still in use today, it describes up to 400 different psychological disorders. You will not be tested on that, but it gives you some good perspective on how far we've come in terms of classifying and diagnosing and treating psychological disorders. So what does this book do? It's divided into 3 sections. There's an introduction, the diagnostic criteria and codes. It's a list of symptoms and what to look for. Kind of like WebMD, but a little bit more well done. And then the final section is emerging measures and models, how to go about diagnosing the actual disorders. There are 2 goals to the DSM: to describe the disorders and to indicate how prevalent they are, and to break it down based on things like age and gender. It is meant to create a reliable resource for diagnosing patients. In other words, if you think you might be suffering from PTSD, if you go to 2 or 3 different psychologists for different opinions, that if you truly have PTSD, that you would get similar diagnosis. That one person's not going to diagnose you with PTSD, and then another psychologist might just say, hey, you're having just bad nightmares and use melatonin to help you sleep. We want something a little bit more official than that. Because remember, with mental illness, it's really hard to know to be objective, because if you have a broken arm, an x-ray can tell you that. If you are suffering from depression, there's no x-ray necessarily to be able to indicate that. And by using the DSM, let me give you some examples here. In field trials of using the DSM to diagnose people, there was a 70% similarity rate of diagnosing someone with PTSD and someone with an autism spectrum disorder. We'll get into what those are later. But that means that the DSM is very useful to be able to identify those two disorders. However, antisocial personality disorder and generalized anxiety disorder, there's only a 20% similarity to diagnosis. I don't feel like that makes a ton of sense. But that raises the question and a criticism that some have of the DSM-5, that it's putting any kind of behavior within the compass of psychiatry. So with a diagnosis like generalized anxiety disorder, that can be really tough because everyone experiences distress. Everyone experiences anxiety at some point. At what point is it abnormal? And is the DSM being too broad where it takes every type of behavior that we have and fits it with 400 different diagnoses and fits it into something? To wrap this lecture up, we need to give some considerations to the labeling of psychological disorders. Some are positive, some not so much. Critics of the DSM-5 also argue that the labels can stigmatize individuals by assigning arbitrary conditions and value judgments. That if you put a label like, for example, ADHD on someone, and someone else learns about that label, that it could make them treat that individual differently. A very famous study that proves the dangers of labeling someone with a mental illness, particularly if they don't have one, was by David Rosenhan in 1973. He wrote a book about his research called Being Sane in Insane Places. This study is also known as the Thud experiment. And basically what he and 7 other volunteers, because he was one of his own volunteers, went to 12 different psychiatric hospitals and complained of hearing voices and saying that these voices felt empty, hollow, and thud-like. Besides this, everything else, every question they answered and everything else about their behavior remained honest and true to how they were feeling. Nearly all of them were diagnosed with schizophrenia. All of them ended up being admitted to these psychiatric hospitals for stays ranging from 7 days to 52 days, and they were given upwards to 2,000 pills collectively, not individually. And they were almost all identified as having trauma in their childhood. Why is this so important? Well, in the 1970s, it greatly discredited the treatment and the processes of psychiatric hospitals. Since then, it has been, psychologists have tried to replicate this study, and it's been shown that it's no longer this easy to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital. But just by giving a couple indications of some symptoms or being a little bit unusual led to this label and these people being treated in such a way that they really did have schizophrenia, even though they didn't at all. Labeling someone as insane is actually a legal term. It is not a medical or even a psychological diagnosis. It is a legal term that means you cannot be held accountable for your actions due to a mental disorder. And that raises moral and ethical questions about how society should treat people who have disorders and have committed crimes. At what point should they be locked up in a prison setting? And at what point should they be allowed to seek treatment? And at what point should they be held accountable for their actions? This is an example, or on the screen is a picture of Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber. In the late 90s, he was arrested after he let off several bombs at universities and airports. And he killed, I believe, 3 people and injured 20 or some more throughout several little bombings. And his lawyers and everyone around him claimed that he did have a mental disorder and he should plead insanity, but he disagreed, and so he ended up in prison. Should he have been stopped and detained? Absolutely. But because he he refused to plead insanity, he did not receive the mental health treatment he probably needed. But finally, labels can be helpful for healthcare professionals. And by labeling a mental illness, it helps these professionals communicate with one another and developing a treatment plan. It can also help the person experiencing the mental illness understand what they're going through a little bit more, to know that they're not alone and that they're not the first person and only person to ever experience what they're experiencing, and to maybe receive some relief that something could be done to potentially treat or cure what they're experiencing. And finally, here's a look at all of the categories of mental disorders found in the DSM-5. You do not need to write these down, but I just want you to look them over so you understand. This will somewhat guide the rest of this unit, and we will look at some of the common patterns and themes of these different categories. And remember, this unit, again, is not just about what you need to know on the AP test. It's about understanding potentially yourself, people in your family, and at the minimum, people around you. And so we can perhaps become more comfortable with discussing and understanding and treating mental illness.